Good afternoon. This is Scott Gray. I'm the Director of Quality Products and Services at AIAG. It's been my privilege for the past 3.5 years to be the project manager of the AIAG and VDA FMEA Handbook project. I'll be starting off today's presentation, and I'll be joined later by Jeremy Hazel, Master Trainer from Plexus International, and then we'll jump right into the presentation. Our agenda for today includes a review of the project objective, an update on the current development status. I'll be presenting some highlights of the new FMEA handbook, as well as talking about the adoption and deployment plans and timing as we know them today. Then Jeremy will pick up and he'll be discussing the essential link between FMEA and cost of quality. And then we'll, at the end, provide some time to go through questions and answers. Speaking of Q&A, this webinar has the feature that you can ask questions at any time using the panel provided. We have somebody looking through those questions, and we'll be responding to some of the questions at the end of the presentation. The questions that we are not able to get to today, we'll be collating and looking to respond to in the near future. The objective of the FMEA project between AIAG and VDA was to provide consistent direction and guidance to all automotive suppliers. The update includes several best practices, improved examples, and a new alignment to functional safety that I'll go over more in a few minutes. We did have members of the SAE J1739 FMEA committee engaged in our project, and so we took efforts to align the new handbook with the upcoming revision of SAE J1739. We wanted to point out how important it is to stay abreast of the latest advancements in methods and tools like the new FMEA handbook. In recent discussion with legal representatives talking about FMEA and product safety, they communicated to us that effective FMEA risk identification has never been more critical for OEMs and suppliers. As I'm sure most of you realize, there's been a rapid growth in component and system interactions, especially with the monitoring and sensor software capabilities of today's vehicles. There are increasingly specialized technologies which not all suppliers may be familiar with. And while the complexity of the systems and vehicles continues to increase, there's no change in legal obligations for producers. Therefore, it's essential that they stay up with the state of the art in automotive product development. From the legal perspective, it's critical that your FMEA activity includes cross-functional team contributions. It's clear that different functions have different perspectives and different priorities, and those all need to be comprehended. It's important for an effective FMEA to carefully identify system boundaries, and there are additional tools in the new AIAG and VDA FMEA handbook to support that. And thorough documentation of risks and actions is also critical, and I'll talk more about the changes in the handbook to support better documentation in my upcoming slides. On current development status, I'm happy to be able to report that the final draft has been approved for release by both AIAG's Quality Steering Committee and VDA's QMA, and both of those approvals from both associations are required to release the publication. Our current timing, looking at release of the handbook, will be in June. We are targeting public sale of the hard copy and e-doc to launch on Monday, June 3rd. That would be English through AIAG and a German translation through VDA. We are acutely aware that the importance of getting other translations out to the industry, and we'll be launching those as soon as we get the translations completed. In the future, you will be able to get all languages from both associations. And then we're aware also that there's quite a bit of interest in training on the new handbook. It is our plan to launch that training in July. Each association is updating unique training courses, so there'll be more communication coming from VDA on what their courses are and when they'll be available. Jeremy will be speaking to the AIAG training courses during his session part of the presentation. I now want to go through some highlights of the major changes and the benefits of these changes. Of course, in the limited time we have available today, I can't really conduct a training session on the new handbook, but I do want to respond to some of the issues we know are out there, and again, then highlight a couple of the key changes that we think are important for the industry to be aware of. So I'll go through the new 7-step approach, talk briefly about the new supplemental FMEA for monitoring and system response. I've talked previously about the new severity, occurrence, and detection tables, so we'll address that in a little bit more detail, and then talk about the action priority tables, the methodology that replaces RPN. Overall, we believe the handbook provides a more structured approach to failure mode and effects analysis. It explains and describes how to leverage lessons learned and the importance of including lessons learned from your manufacturing and field experience into your FMEA activity. And supportive of the automotive approach to quality, it is heavily prevention driven. So this is the new 7-step approach. It did change from the stakeholder review draft. The first step is now called planning and preparation. I'll talk a little bit more about that step on an upcoming slide. We then go into structure analysis, step 2, then function analysis, step 3. Then as we go into failure analysis and risk mitigation, step 4 is failure analysis, step 5 is risk analysis, then step 6 is called optimization. This is another step that we think is a significant change and will be a big benefit for practitioners. And then we've added now the risk communication and results documentation, the 7th step. This 7-step approach applies to DFMEA, the supplemental FMEA for monitoring and system response, and PFMEA. So each of the chapters walks through the methodology step by step, and as I'll show in a few slides, the form sheets are formatted to support that 7-step process. So again, I mentioned the first step called planning and preparation. In this step, one of the key activities is definition of what we call the 5 T's. It's the intent of the FMEA, the timing of the FMEA, when's it going to start, when does it have to get done, what are the key product development milestones that it has to align with, the team, and there's important additions to the team makeup that are described in both DFMEA, PFMEA, and MSR. And then, of course, the task or the assignment of responsibilities in the FMEA process, and then the tools, or how is the team going to deliver the FMEA for the organization. Now, I want to, at this point, address an issue from the stakeholder review draft about the tools used to develop an FMEA. In the stakeholder review draft, the team included a comment that I'll paraphrase here, said if you have a highly complex product or system, you may want to use specialized FMEA software. That comment in the stakeholder review draft received a lot of feedback on that. So we want to be clear here that we have tested, validated with suppliers, that the methodology can be executed with either spreadsheets, again, typically Excel, or specialized FMEA software. There is no recommendation or mandate, either explicitly stated or implied in the new handbook, that practitioners need to use specialized software. We took extra effort throughout each of the chapters, and again, highlighted further in the appendices, that the handbook supports both spreadsheets, and so the output of a spreadsheet analysis would be a form sheet. The output for FMEA software users would be a report view. So we do provide example form sheets and report views. And again, all throughout the chapters, it addresses how to use this methodology from both perspectives. Also in the 7-step approach is this failure chain model. And one of the points here is that failure mode is in the middle of the chain. Failure effects, what's the result or what happens if the failure mode occurs, is on the left. And the failure cause, why did that failure mode occur, is on the right. The focused element in this case is in the middle of the failure chain. And you'll see as I go forward in the presentation how this cascades into the way we use the form sheet. Now, depending on your experience, in a lot of cases, and the former AIAG 4th edition, failure mode was on the left. And so this, while it's a slight change in reality, it does take some getting used to, but we think it helps point the practitioner to where you're focusing, and then kind of upstream cause and downstream effect of that failure mode. So this picture is an example of the concept that we have taken in the AIAG and VDA FMEA Handbook to expand the form sheet more columns in order to be very explicit with the information that's being asked for. So as we go into the structure analysis, left side of this form sheet, the blue highlighted column header is the focus element. Again, that's in the middle, and the next higher level would be to the left, and the lower level would be in the right. And we've color-coded these headers, gray for the left cell, blue for the middle cell, purple for the right-hand cell. And so the arrows show how the information is carried from structure analysis step 2 to function analysis step 3 to failure analysis step 4. In the handbook, there's essentially a build of step-by-step using this approach, so that the data we show you in the figures in the structure analysis section then is carried over following this approach, and we give you the detail for the function analysis. And then there is actually an appendices in the handbook that shows, we call these the hints version of the form sheets, that shows you how the information is carried from cell to cell and how you break down the structure, then the function, then the failures, using both software, the structure tree and the failure tree in the software view, and then the structure, function, and failure in the form sheets. Then after we go through structure, function, and failure analysis, we go into risk analysis, where the severity and occurrence and detection ratings are applied. And I wanted then to jump to step 6, which is optimization. Now, optimization is more formal and different than what we had in the AIAG 4th edition. The purpose of the step is to identify and assign actions to reduce risk. Reduce risk in the design if you're doing DFMEA, reduce risk in the process if you're doing PFMEA. The focus here is the commitment of team members or other support resources to take specific, measurable, and achievable actions to improve the design or the process. So this is design out the issue, make design changes to lower the likelihood of occurrence, or take actions on the detection controls to increase their robustness. The optimization process now keeps track of the original severity and occurrence and detection ratings, and then tracks how those ratings are improved upon during the actual work of the team in the FMEA, so that you can actually learn which actions had the biggest impact on the overall risk rating, and basically where did you end up as a result of optimization. And then if further actions are needed, you can continue to track that until the management and the customer are satisfied. This is the point where that coordination up and down between the team and management on the financial resources to take some of these actions and the timing to take the actions, and the communication up and down the supply chain between the organization, their customers, and suppliers on any actions the suppliers need to take, or that now the customers might need to take to address the residual risks in the product or process. Wanted to make a comment here about the supplemental FMEA for monitoring and system response. Again, this is a supplemental approach. It does not apply to every producer of every product, but typically if your system or product requires functional safety, this would be important for you. It addresses the risk analysis of mechatronic systems. Now, this was covered briefly in the VDA Volume 4, but was not addressed at all in the AIAG 4th edition FMEA. So this new chapter describes the linkages between design FMEA and functional safety, ISO 26262, and the concept of analysis therein. The severity table in MSR is common with the design FMEA, but instead of occurrence, MSR uses a frequency table. And instead of detection, MSR has a monitoring table. And then there also is an action priority table for FMEA MSR. AIG will be creating a special training course specifically for FMEA MSR. It won't be available at launch. But we will be developing and making it available later on in the year. So I know there's a lot of interest in the new severity, occurrence, and detection tables, but because the handbook's not out yet, we are not releasing the full tables. What I can tell you is the severity table looks at the severity of effect. It rates severity from very high, which is a 10 rating, to very low, which is a 1 rating. Occurrence, or the prediction of the failure cause occurring, is rated from extremely high at a 10 to extremely low at a 1. We have included the alternate occurrence tables, which is our incidents per 1,000 items or vehicles, and the time-based failure prediction values. These were very popular from the AIAG 4th edition, and they are now included in the appendices. And then the new detection table looks at the ability to detect, and again rates that from a very low ability to detect, which is a high risk of a 10, to a very high ability to detect, very low risk of a 1. Now, when we're talking about severity, occurrence, and detection, of course, the other big change from AIAG 4th edition to the new AIAG VDA FMEA Handbook is the methodology we call action priority, which replaces RPN in our handbook. So you're probably familiar that RPN, the risk priority number, is the product of severity times occurrence times detection. And it weights each of those factors equally. But I also expect that you're familiar with the weakness of RPN in that it can't really differentiate between different risk scenarios. So if you think about severity, occurrence, and detection all on a 1 to 10 scale, we basically have a 10 by 10 by 10 cube. So that gives us 1,000 unique points to consider how important is the remaining risk in this item. So what we have shown on the slide here is the two scenarios. In the model on the right, scenario A is a severity of 8, an occurrence of 5, and a detection of 2, which gives us an RPN of 80. Scenario B, the smaller in the, seems like in the back red circle, is a severity of 5, an occurrence of 2, and a detection of 8. Now, if you think about those three values, the 8, 5, and 2, there's actually 6 different combinations that will give you an RPN of 80. And in fact, there's several other combinations of severity and occurrence and detection. A severity of 10, an occurrence of 4, a detection of 2, a severity of 4, an occurrence of 5, a detection of 4. There's several risk ratings that all have an RPN of 80. And our team decided that that level of discrimination was, or precision was insufficient in today's analysis. So what we have done in the action priority now is severity, occurrence, and detection are considered at the same time, but severity is weighted the highest, occurrence is rated next, and then detection is weighted the least. And so what we did is we went through and essentially codified all 1,000 points in that cube into the action priority table. So it's not a simple table, but it is a very thorough and robust approach for prioritizing actions as high, medium, and low. Now, if we go back to this table and look at the two scenarios, in action priority, because severity in scenario A is rated an 8, that comes out with an action priority of medium. Whereas scenario B, because the severity is less, even though detection's an 8 and RPN is the same, it has an action priority of low. So this table helps you really prioritize the high severity issues first. And even with the 4th edition RPN approach, there were OEM customer specifics that said, oh, figure out your RPN and then look at severity first and do something with those based on a high severity. So again, what the team did is codified that into this single action priority table. As I mentioned earlier, again, we've provided for both the spreadsheet users and the software users so that in Appendix A, we have all the standard and alternate form sheets, but also the standard and alternate report or software views, or which are potential report layouts for software users. Appendix B then includes those step-by-step hints that I referenced earlier for how the form sheet would look when updated following the examples from step-by-step through DFMEA and step-by-step through PFMEA. Okay, so that wraps up my review of the changes in the new handbook. I do know that one of the most important questions you have is about adoption and deployment timing for the new handbook. So I want to emphasize initially that you should expect a rolling change, as we understand that phrase in the automotive industry, for global deployment of the new FMEA. There is no expectation for rework of your existing FMEAs. As we look at transition actions and potential adoption timing, when the handbook comes out in the first week of June, we know we need to allow several months for the OEMs, the suppliers, and the auditors to be trained in the new methodology. Both AIAG and VDA will have their training available likely in July, but we understand it will take some time to get all that training translated and being delivered regionally around the world to the supply base. As the training is out there and the industry's learning about the new handbook, the OEMs then would have to update their CSRs, their customer-specific requirements, to refer to the new handbook rather than currently in IATF, they refer to FMEA 4th edition and to VDA Volume 4. It is our expectations based on preliminary conversations that the OEMs will adopt the new FMEA gradually. They'll start by accepting the new methods, the tables, and the new form sheets on supplier FMEAs. We then expect them to select a system or a vehicle line and deploy it somewhat limited fashion for only those suppliers on only those systems or just that vehicle. And then finally, over time, they'll evolve to this handbook will be the standard requirement for all new FMEAs around the world. So concurrently with the training, we know the IATF auditors also will need to get trained in the new FMEA methodology. So once the training gets out there, then the IATF will send resources to that training. Then the IATF will have resources modify the Auditor Development Program, or the ADP, the online training and testing resource of third-party auditors, so that ADP would need to get updated. And then all the third-party auditors would have to go through and take that new ADP module and pass the new FMEA content. Then third-party auditors could start auditing your sites for implementation and deployment of the new handbook. We do not, as we're talking today, have the official deployment plans. We have asked and we are expecting that those plans will be communicated from the North American OEMs during the first day of the AIAG Quality Summit here in Novi outside Detroit on October 2nd of this year. Once we have that information communicated from the OEMs, then we'll be able to share that with the rest of the industry and finalize and fine-tune this deployment timing. So I now want to transition to Jeremy Hazel. Again, Jeremy is the Master Trainer on FMEA for Plexus International, and he'll go through the next section of our presentation. Go ahead, Jeremy.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you for tuning in. So what I'd like to go through today is, with the adoption of this new FMEA, it's a really good time to start talking about the link between FMEA and your cost of quality. So what I'd like to start off with, I'd really like to just make this linkage by saying you can leverage a robust FMEA to make sure the cost of quality or the cost of poor quality improvement targets are met. Now, how do you kind of set these targets? If you've got existing FMEAs, you've got existing projects, and you're looking at moving into the new FMEA manuals, you then can leverage existing or similar products or processes. And the thing here is, you want to make sure that in this FMEA methodology, that the process is actually paying its way, and that your FMEA risk evaluation of your new product is actually realistic. So if you link cost of quality, let's look at cost of quality as, say, the appraisal and the prevention, and you compare it up to cost of poor quality, you can almost balance how cost of quality can reduce the cost of poor quality to kind of make this happen. So I just kind of want to share with you kind of, if you're not familiar with that cost of quality model, across the board, just talking in generalities here, we can see that there are 4 big buckets or categories that cost of quality falls into. There's external failure costs, and we're going to make this really simple. It's anything that happens outside. You're talking about customer complaints, warranty, premium freight, field recalls, anything like that. Then you've got internal failure cost. Now, that's anything that happens inside. So it could be scrap, rework, sorting that doesn't get out the door. So I would say these two things we're going to consider COPQ, which is cost of poor quality. Now, on the other side of that coin, you've got appraisal costs, which we're going to make really simple here. We're going to say anything with testing in it is an appraisal cost. So notice the bullet point there, it says as defined in the control plan. So your control plan actually can be used to get an idea for your appraisal costs. And what we've been talking about here today, the very active FMEA, is an actual prevention cost, because you folks in the industry, you're going to take time to create an FMEA. You're going to expend effort to do an FMEA. And the payback that you hope you get from that FMEA through prevention is a decrease in the external or internal failure cost. So I kind of covered this a little bit earlier. FMEA activity is closely tied to the prevention cost, right? That's what you're doing. The control plan is closely tied to appraisal cost, because partially in the control plan, you know who's checking it, you know how much you pay them to check it, you know how often they're checking it, and you know how many they're checking. So you can almost balance these two, because if the external and the internal failure costs are greater than the prevention activity, then the FMEA is ineffective at providing the value that you expect. In this new FMEA methodology, as Scott's gone through for the last 30 minutes, is in prime position to be a valuable asset in making this connection and actually driving down those costs through the failure chain model that he just introduced to you. So even if we take a look at the big four categories, your FMEA is going to be key when comparing it up to the external and internal failure cost. If you've done a good job in FMEA, scrap costs, rework costs should drop within an acceptable limit, whatever that is for you, and external costs should drop as well. Okay? So what do I do with this information, right? We wanted to give you a couple things right off the bat that you could do today to kind of look at these FMEAs and prime yourself for your rollout here. When you look at the occurrence with this new method, even though you don't have the table, occurrence values in some way need to be representative of the frequency that it occurs, not the frequency that it escapes. So when you look at the occurrence value, you should be calculating your scrap and your rework percentages into the occurrence. Because the question, whether it's the current model or this new integrated model, is it's not how often it escaped, it's how often it occurs. The only reason it doesn't get out the door might be due to your detection. So the first thing you could do, take a look at the FMEA, compare the occurrence value up to where you say it is versus where the data says it is, and this will give you a really good baseline to make more informed choice. The second thing that you could do today right off the bat, you could take each piece of scrap, lay out your top Paretoed scrap items, and every piece of scrap, when you look at the cause of that scrap, should have a place in that FMEA. Because the very idea that it's in the scrap bin is non-fulfillment of a requirement. So that's two ways that you could immediately take a look at the FMEAs, take a look at how you're going to move forward, and get a baseline in terms of where you are when you start moving forward. Okay. So what do you do now, right? The first thing you want to do, as Scott said, you want to familiarize yourself. Familiarize yourself and your FMEA development team with the new AIAG and VDA FMEA Handbook. And we talked about when that's may be released and how you go about getting that. Second step, identify the gaps. Identify the gap in your current FMEA development process. So you identify the gap and address them to meet the new approach explained in the handbook and explained by Scott earlier. And step three, provide the training. Provide appropriate training for all the parties. And the upcoming training courses, as Scott mentioned, can be found at that AIAG website. So that's where you go to get the information on it. And again, because they had 7 steps in their handbook, we got 7 steps here. You'll revisit the gap analysis after the training, because I think that there's going to be a lot of information floating around, and I think after the training you'll be far more equipped to make an informed gap analysis post-training. And then you actually implement. And I think that Scott had a very good point here. implement it on a project and record the lessons learned of the use of the new methodology. So much like he was saying, a lot of these OEMs may pick one project and flow it down to those suppliers in that pilot project. You'll pick one pilot project and you'll take it from the pinnacle all the way to the end there. And then lastly, once you've got your lessons learned, you figure out what went well, what didn't go so well. You standardize across all the processes and update your process based on the new handbook. And then step 7, much like everything else, continually improve. So I think that's a pretty good flow of where we want to be. I think that there's a connection between the financial performance of the organization from a cost of quality standpoint and the ability to do a robust FMEA utilizing this new methodology to drive the results that your organization is looking for. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Scott to wrap up, and I think that you guys may do some Q&A.
That's right, Jeremy. Thank you. Appreciate that. So Jeremy and I will now be answering some questions that we've received from all of you. One is a question that came in: is there an overview of the changes? And the answer is yes. It is explicitly provided in Appendix F of the handbook. F as in Frank. There's a change point summary, step by step, for DFMEA from AIAG 4th edition, DFMEA, PFMEA, and also from the VDA Volume 4, DFMEA, PFMEA, and the mechatronics section that was in there previously in their volume. So there was change point summaries, pretty good detail, not only the what changed, but the why did we change that is provided in the appendix of the handbook. The other question I wanted to hit on real quickly, there are several questions coming in that I tried to answer with this slide. So one more time, there is no expectation for rework of existing FMEAs. And think about this practically. We're going to release the handbook. None of the third-party auditors have seen anything but the stakeholder review draft from 2 years ago. So all of the third-party auditors will have to be trained and tested and confirmed knowledgeable before there would be any auditing of the new FMEA during your IATF surveillance audits. Further, even when AIAG and VDA release the document, it does not become a formal requirement until the OEMs write it into their customer-specific requirements. So, if you're connected to the IATF Global Oversight website and you have signed up for the automatic updates, anytime the IATF OEM customer specifics are updated, you would receive a notice. So before this is an auditable requirement, you would have to see those customer specific requirements being updated, and then all of the IATF auditors globally would have to be trained and tested and approved. So I'm expecting it could be months before this is actually checked during an IATF surveillance audit. So there are several questions about the modifying FMEAs, and hopefully that cleared that up. The other question, and I guess I want to be clear here, this is not the 5th edition. This is a first AIAG and VDA FMEA Handbook, 1st edition 2019. So at this point, the VDA Volume 4 and the AIAG 4th edition FMEA will not be updated further. And again, in a rolling change approach, the industry will gradually transition over to the new handbook. There is no requirement for formal training either by AIAG or VDA. Of course, we support it, we suggest it, we think it's a good practice to have your folks trained by somebody that is knowledgeable in the methodology, but there's no requirement for further training, for formal training, excuse me. There's a question coming in about updating of the other core tools, and that's a little bit out of scope for today's discussion. I will try to address that formally, though, and post the answer. There's a question about, have we added the reverse FMEA concept as it's a requirement, a customer-specific requirement of some of the OEMs? That answer is no. Reverse FMEA is not included because it's only a customer-specific of some, and the other OEMs were not ready to adopt that. It's not in this new industry handbook. The official language for the handbook is English. And again, AIAG and VDA, because we collaborate so significantly on the IATF, we're collaborating as well in the translation of the new FMEA. And so if you're familiar with the IATF approach, we'll go through a number of those translations, and they'll be added to the portfolio as we get them done. As you know, the 40% of all IATF certificates in the world are in China, so the Chinese translation is already underway. No, you cannot get a copy of the draft. No, you cannot get a copy of the handbook before the 3rd of July. At this point, sorry, the 3rd of June. Thank you. There was a question about providing more details about the 7th step, the results documentation step. We did suggest some content, and it ties closely to the 7-step approach. So as you go in and look at planning and preparation, you're making certain decisions there about what the scope of your analysis was, what the timing was. And so part of the results documentation is to basically compare where did we end up, what's your actual versus what was the plan. We got it done on time. We did or we did not have to change the scope after we started. And it provides an outline of a FMEA report, but it's not a mandated report. It's a model and a recommendation. A question about the function analysis and compared to the yellow print. And yes, we have updated the examples since the VDA's term is the yellow print, the AIAG term is the stakeholder review draft. That was the fall of 2017. So there are more examples, and the examples carry through from chapter to chapter and build upon each other so you can follow that progression. There's a question here about, does this apply to simple components? Every component, whether it's, a nut or a screw or something very simple, one plastic molded bracket, it still has a function. And even if it's just a single part, it might have multiple raw ingredients that go into it. So yeah, function analysis, structure analysis is still required regardless of the type of component. Question about the FMEA spreadsheet. Again, in the Appendix A, there are both the standard spreadsheet and several alternate spreadsheets provided. There are also these software report views included in that same appendix, so you could look at what would this look at like, whether I was using software or a spreadsheet. But I guess I should probably answer this question. There's a question about will new FMEA training of AIAG and VDA be harmonized? No, each organization is updating their own training. So VDA will have a portfolio of training courses. AIAG will as well. I do believe that each association will have essentially what we call the transitioning class, assuming you already knew FMEA and now you're learning just about the updates. Eventually there'll be a class for assuming you're brand new to the automotive industry and you need to learn everything about FMEA. We call that the Implementing and Understanding course. I know that VDA is also planning a unique course on the supplemental FMEA for monitoring and system response. And it could, because that methodology does apply just to some products and therefore some suppliers. So there'll be a unique class around MSR. And then the other, the handbook references in the team section a moderator facilitator role. That's not totally a common role industry-wide. Europe uses the moderator term. The United States, facilitator is more common, but some companies utilize that as a unique role in the FMEA activity. We are planning to have a unique training class for that training. There was a question about, is there going to be a preferential scheduling of training to the IATF auditors? At this point, no, but I will address that with the oversight offices of the IATF, and they'll be meeting next week or possibly the week after, I believe. And we'll have them address that question and be able to provide some information back through the IATF website. A question about certified training providers, and that's a great question. At this point in time, AIAG and VDA developed the methodology. While we have talked about this at conferences and so forth around the globe over the last couple of years, related to the current edition, no one except AIAG or VDA has all of the up-to-date information. Our belief is AIAG and VDA are the places to get the training, or their licensed training providers, and it's our perspective that you should only take training from one of AIAG or VDA's licensed training partner. Relative to training, whether it's here or on-site,
Yep. The plan is to do on-site as well as training at AIAG, so I believe that they will both be available.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. We are developing an e-learning module. Our view of e-learning is that should be focused on that the e-learning would be focused on really the basics. And so it would give you some of the basic information, but there might be issues, again, in more of a workshop approach, some of the classroom examples that really get you into learning this, not only the methodology, but what do I need to do in my process back at my company to embody the new process and support the new process. So there will be some e-learning, but again, that'll be the basics, and we highly suggest the classroom or on-site training for the deeper dive. We got a couple of questions that have come in. The software products that are out there in the world, currently have not received the latest changes in the AIAG and VDA FMEA Handbook. I do expect that all the software providers, once the handbook is out, will be updating their products. AIAG as well. Our software product, CTS, does not currently support the 4th edition. The product was launched earlier this year, and that was before the handbook came out. So right now, the AIAG CTS only supports the 4th edition. It is in the process of being updated, and our software is a cloud solution, and so it'll be updated and rolled out to all the owners at that time. Lastly, as we look at wrapping up here, we'll be doing 2 things. We'll be taking the rest of the questions we weren't able to answer today and providing some responses back through the AIAG website. And we are planning to, this webinar has been recorded, and we are planning that it will be posted on the AIAG website for you or your colleagues to view and listen to next week. And with that, I think we're through. And so thank you very much for attending, and look forward to seeing you in our training courses and hearing from you in the future.